So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. We're back for what I hope is the last video in this series. I originally thought we'd only have 1 or 2 videos about this, but then the creationist sent me to do a lot of homework. Homework that Phil helped out with. So make sure to express your appreciation in the comments. Now, Answers in Genesis Canada are going to read some of the responses they've gotten to their 15 questions pamphlet, and we're going to look at both the response and their reaction to it. It's going to be very meta. Well, let's hear from Calvin Smith and his sidekick, who's so unimportant I haven't bothered to find out or remember his name.
So, we did have some people write in and try to give answers to the question.
As with the other questions.
Yes. And so answer number 1 came back and it said, if only 8 mutations per year were passed on for 3 billion years, that gives 3 gigabytes of information.
Well, that's going to depend on what those mutations are. Are we assuming single point mutations? What if some of them are deletions? You have to be much more specific with this. Person who I don't even know is real and who wrote into a creationist show probably like a decade or more ago.
Which is true.
The 3 billion DNA letters in the human genome.
Right.
I guess we were assuming that it's actually an addition of a single nucleotide each time. Weird, but yeah, I guess that's true. This is a weird response, since most populations don't accumulate mutations nearly that fast. And also, single nucleotide additions are not very common mutations compared to the sum of all other mutations. And we also know that the vertebrate lineage has had at least 1 full genome duplication, which is probably where the bulk of the genome comes from. So all in all, this is not how I'd respond to any of this.
However, there's a challenge with this. You need to define that, for example. It's not just if only 8 mutations were passed on. It would have to be 8 information-gaining mutations that coded for some new function or feature or special ability.
No, actually, it would just have to be single nucleotide insertions and you'd have that amount of information. The amount of information is the amount of information regardless of what it does. Noise is information. In fact, it's generally more information than the so-called meaningful parts of the signal. But really, the problem that the creationists are putting forward isn't how did the actual physical bulk of the genome come to be, but more how did new genes or new functions for old genes come about? And the answer to that is a combination of things like subfunctionalization, neofunctionalization, gene duplication, promoter duplication, and such things. All of which are observed, none of which are hypothetical, and all of which can combine with selection or in some cases drift to create new genes, new metabolic processes, and even new organs.
That wasn't in the organism to begin with.
This part is where I want to point out that creationists are usually not asking this in good faith. You see, when presented with nylonase, a brand new enzyme evolved by some bacteria to break down and digest, yep, you guessed it, nylon, I've seen the response that since nylonase is a modified enzyme that previously existed, it doesn't count. But that's how evolution works. It's modifications of what came before. If that doesn't count as evolution, then nothing does. But that's the thing, creationism isn't about facts, evidence, or science. It's held to despite those things, not because of them. It's a pseudoscience, pure and simple.
Right.
So if you're a bat and you don't have echolocation, and all of a sudden you have echolocation, that would be a neat new mutation because it would give you a new ability, right?
Sure, but echolocation is not the result of a single ability. But also, being able to echolocate isn't a binary state. Some blind humans can do rudimentary echolocation by tapping a cane forcefully on the ground and listening to the reverb to determine the approximate size and shape of the space they're in. It doesn't actually require special mutations to echolocate at this basic level. But if you're a nocturnal animal who's hunting for insects and navigating a complex 3D world, you're already using all your senses, and your chittering, which you already use to communicate with your conspecifics, is also giving you feedback in the form of echoes. Echolocation in the sophisticated form that bats and whales both use is a refinement of hearing and normal animal calls. Just like with the nylonase, it's a refinement of what came before. It doesn't pop into existence ex nihilo. The same is true for basically any complex body part or behavior you can name. Jaws are actually modified gill arches, teeth are modified skin structures, arms and legs are modified fish fins. Even the eye is basically modified skin.
If you don't have teeth and all of a sudden you get teeth through a mutation?
Which again isn't how this works. Teeth probably started out as denticles, the kind of skin covering that sharks have, which are essentially tiny teeth that cover the skin. Then a mutation that made them more prominent in the mouth occurred early in the vertebrate line, which was obviously useful for food acquisition. Then they became more and more specialized for food acquisition and processing, while the ones on the rest of the skin were replaced by other kinds of skin covering, which is why animals like humans have teeth in their mouths, but not all over their body, which is already a rather horrifying concept.
That would be a good, beneficial mutation.
The more and more study that's done on the human genome and other animals as well.
Yeah.
The notion of junk DNA, which was popular years ago,
has only been confirmed. Junk DNA, that is, non-functional DNA, makes up the majority of the human genome and basically every other animal genome we've looked at.
is falling by the wayside. Most of those 3 billion letters code for something valuable, for something important.
Nope, we know for a fact that most of them don't. And the way we know is twofold, and both ways are pretty simple. The first is knockout tests. Now, it's obviously unethical to do these tests on humans, but it turns out that mice and humans have very similar genomes, because rodents and primates are actually fairly closely related. You can take a mouse genome and remove like 80% of it, and have a fully functional, happy, healthy mouse that can even grow to have happy, healthy mouse pups when it meets another mouse of the opposite sex. The other way we know is that you can see the different rates at which different parts of the human genome accumulate mutations by doing comparative studies, and then look at regions of high or low variation in the genome between individual humans. And what we find when we do that is that the areas that are not known to regulate, promote, or code for anything have much higher rates of mutation accumulation, indicating that they are not sequence constrained. That is, nothing about the sequence of the nucleotides in that bit of DNA has any effect on the survival of the host organism, because changes there aren't being affected by natural selection. No creationists have, to my knowledge, proposed a function for these regions of the genome that does not require sequence specificity. And if a function requires sequence specificity, and that function is actually useful to the organism's reproductive output, then it will be under selection.
So
yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the mutations that we see and what they actually do, and the fact that you can have beneficial mutations. But we need to define this as, it would have to be 8 mutations that added genetic information that was useful and meaningful, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And you know what? That's assuming that those things actually occur, and we haven't seen it.
Yes, we do, and have already listed many examples in this series, so I won't do so again. But this is a lie, and I suspect it's one that Calvin just told knowingly. He has been doing this long enough, even at this point, to be exposed to other counterexamples.
That's the problem. I mean, you're saying this is. It's kind of like saying, well, if pigs had wings, they could probably fly.
I don't know. Lots of things that can't fly have wings anyways, like some species of beetle, ostriches, kakapos, etc.
I mean, I don't want to be really facetious here, but it is like saying that, because if you haven't seen it, if it's not happening, if science isn't recording that, it's just a wishful...
Yes, it's an if-then. Yeah. If this happens, then this could be true.
That could be true, and so on. So we haven't seen that.
Well, we have seen beneficial mutations that create whole new proteins and metabolic pathways, but what we haven't seen is any evidence of a global flood or God creating anything at all, let alone living things. Seems like we have a bit of a pot calling the kettle black. Also, my kettle is chrome and electrical. Maybe we need a new saying. It's like the creationists calling the flat earther a liar. I don't like it. I'll workshop it. If you have suggestions, put them in the comments.
And second,
so that's our first response to that question.
That's right. We just haven't.
If you have a whole bunch of time and you have these mutations passed on generation to generation, and he said 8. Did he not say?
Yep.
If only 8 mutations were passed on in 3 billion years, we need to do another show on this. But it's actually much worse than 8.
My dino sense is tingling. I think he's about to go talk about genetic entropy.
It's 60 point mutations is the latest figure.
Right.
Latest figure for what? But before we see if that question is going to be answered, I want to remind you to hit like, share this video, and leave a comment before you move on to something else. You probably know that YouTube can be very fickle, and as of the time of recording, this has been hitting a lot of channels with lower views and watch times. So everything you can do to help the video reach more people helps a lot. It's free to you, but it means the world to me.
But that's only point mutations within the human genome. 60 per generation.
Right, that are occurring right now.
Yes.
So more than the 8 that were being talked about. I guess that's probably significant to something, but I don't even follow where this is going. And I can follow along when my geneticist friends talk about their work. So I don't think it's a me thing.
And of course the problem is most of them...
They're not they're information destroying.
No, they're information changing, and the vast majority are in non-functional and so non-sequence constrained regions. Let's just assume that all loci in the genome have an equal probability of mutation, which is actually very generous because coding regions actually have fewer mutations, but let's just assume. That means that 48 of the 60 are going to be in regions where they don't matter at all. On average, about a third of point mutations will result in no change to the actual function of a codon. They won't matter either, bringing us down to 8 mutations that will actually likely change anything. On top of this, most proteins are pretty robust to having a large portion of their amino acid sequence altered, which is why there are more than 1,000 variations on hemoglobin across the human population. So of those 8, chances are that most of them will do absolutely nothing, and in a few people they will cause a problem, and in some much smaller proportion they will be a benefit, conferring something like what we've already seen: lactose tolerance, stronger bones, stronger muscles, resistance to malaria, resistance to heart disease, resistance to HIV infection, etc. All of these are documented mutations that have occurred in humans.
They do what mutations do. They wreck things.
Right.
Except when they don't.
And so if that had been happening for 3 billion years, that would have been a problem.
Yes, if evolution proceeded according to the straw man version that creationists like to make up, it wouldn't have worked. Good thing that the version bears only a passing resemblance to the actual model of evolution and common descent.
So the second, one of the problems is, as the population grows larger, it's harder to fix new mutations in the population. This is because of the cost of substitution. This is what they call Haldane's dilemma.
Oh, Haldane's dilemma. I guess not technically genetic entropy. Of course, one of the things I want to point out is that Haldane was not saying that the dilemma was real. It couldn't be, because if it were, then according to Haldane, most species couldn't survive 300 generations. He was highlighting that some of the models of genetics used in his day had to be wrong on some level. This is usually what's happening when a scientist proposes a paradox or dilemma. One of my favorite such proposals was Olber's paradox. You see, in the early 20th century, it was known that the universe was bigger than the Milky Way, and most astronomers thought it was more or less static, infinite in size, infinite in age, and homogeneous at the largest scales. But if this is true, then there is no single angle that one could look into the sky from that should not intersect the surface of at least one star, barring the very rare shadow from a planet or a moon. This should mean that literally every part of the sky should be about as bright as the surface of the sun. Clearly, this is not the case, which means that something about the eternal static model of the universe had to be wrong. It turns out that what was wrong is that the universe is neither static nor eternal. Haldane's dilemma and the Olber paradox don't show that reality is wrong. They show that some part of the theory or model is wrong.
And I guess we should probably spend a little bit of time here, because if
You're going to explain that.
Yeah, if people aren't familiar with it, we had Dr. Don Batten. He's a scientist with our organization, and he did
Calvin is too young for a Mitch McConnell moment here.
An article you can check out on the website. We'll put the name up here. It's creation.com/Haldane.
Amazing. Get another bit of homework. At least this one isn't a terribly long article. Well, let's go and make sure you show your appreciation for Ferrara yet again lending his voice to the channel.
Haldane's dilemma has not been solved.
I mean, it has though, but hey, let's see what Don Batten has for us.
The famous evolutionary geneticist J.B.S. Haldane, 1892 until 1964, was one of the 3 founders of the field of study known as population genetics.
Along with R.A. Fisher and Sewell Wright, friend of the channel Zach B. Hancock has a video about the 3 of them, and you should check it out.
Haldane articulated a serious problem for evolutionary theory in a seminal paper in 1957, The Cost of Substitution.
Well, it was at one time a seriously puzzling question, but now it's seen kind of like the problem of the changes in the precession of Mercury. You see, all the planets seem to follow Newton's laws quite well, except Mercury. The orientation of its orbit, or more technically its argument of perihelion, shifted more than Newton would predict. This led to people hypothesizing that maybe there was a planet even closer to the Sun that was perturbing the orbit of Mercury. It was called Vulcan, and although various people claimed to see it, it was never confirmed to exist. And now we know that it did not exist. So what explained this problem for Newtonian mechanics? Well, we didn't really have a full picture of gravity, and while Newton's laws worked well for most things we observed, in extreme circumstances, they didn't work anymore. It took Einstein's special relativity to give us a mechanical and theoretical framework to resolve the problem. Similarly, Haldane's dilemma was resolved by further work in the theory of evolution, which brought us a better theoretical understanding of evolution and population genetics, much like Einstein's relativity work brought us a better theoretical understanding of gravity.
When a beneficial mutation occurs in a population, it has to increase in the number of copies for the population to progress evolutionarily.
Creationists just can't use English normally, can they? It has to spread in order for the mutation to fix in the population. That's the phrase he needs there. Progress isn't defined in evolution. Evolution isn't goal-oriented. It doesn't push creatures to become higher versions of themselves, whatever that means.
If the mutation remained in one individual, then evolution cannot proceed. This is fairly obvious.
Technically, that's not true, since the introduction of a new allele is itself evolution, but I will assume that he means that there will be no long-term directional change, and that's probably true. Don is really bad at writing about evolution.
In other words, it has to substitute for the non-mutated genes in the population.
There are no such things. All the alleles of all the genes and the genes themselves are the product of previous mutations. There is no sense in which one organism is more or less mutated than another, except in how many mutations it has as an individual. But that sense is not heritable. If an animal's mother had 150 mutations and its father had 100, and on top of that the offspring had 50, then that offspring is less mutated than either parent by that definition. The level of mutation doesn't compound in any meaningful sense. This idea of there being mutant and non-mutant genes and alleles assumes that there is some initial diversity that does not come from mutation and that we can uncover in organisms. No one has ever been able to do that. And so until creationists can recover a non-mutation-derived ancestral genome, it makes no sense to talk about some parts of the genome being not mutated. As it is, actual scientists have discovered that all parts of the genome have a coalescence time, a time in the past where the ancestral state for all extant members of the population shared an ancestral state. That is, the common ancestral state of that part of the genome. And that time varies across different parts of the genome, which cannot be true if some large degree of diversity just poofed into existence at one time.
But the rate at which this can happen is limited. A major factor limiting the rate of substitution is the reproduction rate of the species.
That's true.
And it makes sense. Elephants clearly can't spread a new allele as quickly as, say, mayflies. What with elephants being some of the slowest reproducing animals out there, whereas mayflies sometimes hatch, live, reproduce, and die in the span of a few months, and so can spread alleles orders of magnitude faster. The question, of course, is, are there any organisms for which their reproduction is so slow that we cannot account for their evolution within the time available to us? The answer is no. Or to put it in more words, the answer is that no such organism has been discovered. One group of organisms that I have discovered, much to my delight, are my patrons on Patreon. Patreon is probably the best way to support me, as it's where I get to keep the largest percent of what is sent to me. And joining there gets you early access to videos like this, access to my Discord server for supporters only, as well as other perks at higher tiers. It starts at only $1 a month, and there's a 15% discount for pledging annually. So why not go ahead and check out the link in the description and join the team that are helping me keep this channel going.
For a human-like creature with a generation time of about 20 years and low reproduction rate per individual, the rate of growth in numbers of a mutation in a population will be exceedingly slow.
This is something you need to look out for with science writing, or in this case, pseudoscience writing. Science is about numbers and facts. Saying something like exceedingly slow doesn't mean anything in science. There's not a particular threshold for what counts as exceeding. Exceeding in this case is a weasel word. It's there so that the creationist doesn't actually have to be tied down by any real numbers that can be checked on. Is human reproduction too slow? Well, maybe, but let's see how Don makes the argument.
This is basically the cost of substitution.
What is? The rate of reproduction? Well, that's not true. The cost of substitution, as well as the strength of selection, is well defined by Haldane. The strength of selection is the natural log of the proportion of those organisms with the optimal genotype who reproduce divided by the proportion of the entire population who reproduce. So if 80% of the population with the optimal genotype reproduce, and overall 75% of the population reproduce, then the strength of selection is 0.064, and the cost of selection is the quotient of deaths without reproduction of those with the optimal genome minus the same for the overall population, or in this case, 0.05.
Imagine a population of 100,000 apes.
Done.
The putative progenitor of humans.
I was imagining humans, since they are apes. Okay, I'll imagine something that's like the common ancestor of all apes, so a population of apes that existed a bit less than 20 million years ago or so.
Suppose that a male and a female both received a mutation so beneficial that they outsurvive everyone else.
Huh? That's not how that works. Beneficial mutations don't generally work by killing those without the mutation. I guess that could work, like a mutation that causes those with it to be aggressive to the point of killing those without it, but I'm not aware of any such mutation existing in real life. As you can tell from Haldane's definitions, it's about proportionality. If the general population before this mutation already had an overall reproduction rate of 0, then they'd just be extinct. Competition in evolution is rarely so direct that the more fit literally cause the death of the less fit. So already we're off to a bad and rather insane start.
All the rest of the population died out, all 99,998 of them.
Yay, math.
And then the surviving pair had enough offspring to replenish the population in 1 generation.
I feel like we're not talking about apes at this point, but okay. By the way, the strength of selection in this case is 8.5, which is a bit crazy.
And this repeated every generation, every 20 years, for 10 million years.
So half the time from the first ape progenitor of humans to humans. Okay, I feel like maybe Don didn't have the first apes in mind. It would be a lot easier if he just write clearly instead of writing like he has a rotten cabbage for a brain.
Rotten cabbages? What kind of slum do you think this is? Oh, my cabbages!
More than the supposed times as the last common ancestors of humans and apes.
Nope, it's about half that time. Maybe if by apes he specifically means chimpanzees, then that might make more sense, but he didn't say that. And of course, the last common ancestor of a human and any ape is just their parents if they have siblings, since the parents of any ape are an ape, and all humans are apes. Is this just supposed to confuse people into believing that science is wrong? Is that the tactic? Why does anyone ever let Don Batten near a typewriter or a word processor? He seems more like he should be in a padded room with crayons, but hey, I'm no psychologist.
That would mean that 500,000 beneficial mutation could be added to the population.
Yeah, sure, why not?
I.e. 10 million divided by 20.
Thanks for the math.
Even with this completely unrealistic scenario, which maximizes evolutionary progress,
there is no such thing as evolutionary progress. There is evolutionary change, and this in no way maximizes it, since it eliminates several of the things that speed up molecular change, such as neutral variations and genetic drift, parallel mutations, and recombination. And you may not be surprised to learn that a combination of these things neatly solves Haldane's dilemma. So let's talk about each one in turn. First, neutral variation and genetic drift. It turns out that the vast majority of mutations have no actual fitness effect. Yet, because some parts of survival and reproduction are chance-based, neutral variation in a population will change from generation to generation, and some neutral variations will become universal in a population's genome. That is, they will reach fixation. There is no cost of selection associated with this, yet it still accounts for large amounts of the variation between populations. Second, parallel mutations, which isn't really a technical term, because really all that's happening is mutations in different individuals in the population. In Don's hypothetical, we only ever have 2 organisms reproducing, and in real life, one organism can have a beneficial mutation, while another organism can have another beneficial mutation, and they can both increase in prevalence through the population at the same time. So unlike his thought experiment, in reality, we don't have to wait for each mutation to fix before the next can occur. Finally, recombination occurs during meiosis, that is, the process by which gametes or sex cells are produced. During this event, chromosomes of the same type will swap parts, so that the resultant chromosomes are often a mixture of material from different chromosomes. So in your egg or sperm cells, you will have chromosomes that are a mix of those inherited from both your parents. So your chromosome 4 in one of your gametes might be 80% from your mother and 20% from your father. This means that those different alleles that are beneficial that are coming about in parallel could end up on the same chromosome, even if they didn't start that way, allowing beneficial mutations to accumulate. All these processes happen in parallel, and all of them are unaccounted for by Haldane. These are the parallels to Einstein's inclusion of warped spacetime and the speed limit of the speed of light, which combined to explain why Mercury was acting weird all this time. Haldane didn't know about genetic drift, recombination, and did not really account for parallel mutations. As a result, his calculations were wrong when actually applied to real organisms. That Don is repeating and in some cases exacerbating these problems is just evidence that he doesn't know what he's talking about, not that evolution is wrong.
Only about 0.02% of the human genome could be generated.
What? Why does it need to be generated? All the previous species of apes had a genome about the same size as the human genome. I honestly have no idea what he's trying to get across with this. Does he think that the ancestor of humans and chimpanzees had no genome? That seems pretty dumb even for a creationist.
Considering that the difference between the DNA of a human and a chimp, our supposed closest living relative, is greater than 5%, evolution has an obvious problem in explaining the origin of genetic information in a creature such as a human.
No, it doesn't. So the first degree of difference in the DNA isn't an actual measurement. There's no single overall number that you can use as the difference between humans and chimps in their genomes. That's because genomes are complex. For example, let's say one lineage has a section of DNA that gets reversed in a mutation, and that fixes. Let's say the reversal is 20 base pairs long. Is that 20 differences or one difference? It depends on how you count, and there is no one right answer. So the question of how many mutations would it take to get from the common ancestor of chimps and humans is that there's no easy way to know for sure. Second, Don seems to assume that all the change was on the part of the human lineage, but there's no reason to think this. It should be closer to 50% of the difference arising on the human side and 50% on the chimp side. Although in actuality, there is some reason to think that chimps might actually be more derived than humans, and so it might be more like 40% on the human side and 60% on the chimp side. Third, this whole idea is based on his ridiculous strawman of how evolution works that doesn't take into account any of the reasons that are given to resolve Haldane's dilemma. It's like complaining that relativity is false and pointing at Mercury, the very thing that was solved by relativity.
However, with more realistic rates of fitness or selection and population replenishment, the number of beneficial mutations that can be accounted for plummets.
It does the opposite, in fact, as I've already gone over.
Haldane calculated that no more than 1,667 beneficial substitutions could have occurred in the supposed 10 million years since the last common ancestor of apes and humans.
And he was wrong.
This is a mere one substitution per 300 generations on average. The origin of all that makes us uniquely human has to be explained within this limit.
No, it doesn't, because for one thing, fixation doesn't have to be selected for, it can be the result of chance. And for two, more than one mutation can be going towards fixation at a time, so that even if the average time for an allele to fix is 300 generations, the rate at which various alleles can fix in the population can be far, far higher. If just 10 alleles are going towards fixation in a population, then the average time for them to go to fixation can be 300 generations, while the rate of fixation within the population would be every 30 generations. Further, there is no guarantee that each of the differences between the genomes of humans and chimps make humans uniquely human in some sense. Some of them, probably most of them, are going to be neutral variation with no effect on phenotype.
A substitution is a single mutational event. It can be a gene duplication or a chromosomal inversion or a single nucleotide substitution.
Normally, only single nucleotide substitution is meant, but whatever. He can stipulate a definition for the purposes of this article, provided that he's consistent with it.
Biologists have found that the vast majority of substitutions are indeed single nucleotides.
I think that's true, but I'm not going to check. If you have a source that says otherwise, you should let me know in the comments, but do be warned that YouTube will hold comments with URLs in them, so just don't send a link.
So Haldane's limit puts a severe constraint on what is possible with evolution, because 1,667 single nucleotide substitution amounts to less than one average-sized gene.
He really does seem to think the genomes just grow one nucleotide at a time by inserting one base pair every once in a while. This reminds me of talking to Jungle Jargon, a creationist of no consequence, and having him tell me, in all earnestness, that batteries work by storing electrons, and to charge them was to pump electrons into them, because apparently the power going to your house is just an electron pipe that sends electrons into things that you power with it. This misunderstanding is so fundamental that it's hard to imagine anyone with an advanced degree would have it. Yet reportedly, Don Batten has a PhD from the University of Sydney, which is a rather prestigious and long-standing institution. In case it's not obvious, genes are not built one nucleotide at a time, nor are genomes. Whole large chunks are often added, and new genes normally come about through a mutation creating a new gene directly from pre-existing sections of the genome in a process called neofunctionalization. The rate of single nucleotide substitutions or additions has nothing to do with how big the genome is.
It should also be noted that Haldane made a number of simplifying assumptions that actually optimized the number of substitutions that would be possible.
Except that we know that many of his assumptions, such as no crossover and no sexual reproduction, greatly reduce the number of mutations that can fix in a population. So even if some other of his assumptions increase that number, his assumptions overall vastly underestimate it. And we can tell because if he were right, humans wouldn't be here to talk about it. If you apply Haldane's dilemma to humans, humans couldn't make it 2 or 3 generations. Yet I see humans every day, and near as I can tell from looking into genealogical information, most humans can trace their ancestry back more than 3 generations. And some of them can do it for dozens of generations.
So in reality, the number of substitutions possible is much less than Haldane calculated.
What I believe is dumb.
Furthermore, if we accept what the paleontologists say, that the vast majority of species' existence is spent in stasis,
that's morphological stasis, not molecular stasis. You can't tell that at some point in the existence of, say, Triceratops horridus, that a new, more efficient digestive protein evolved, and then swept through the population, fixing in place in only a few dozen generations. That's a hypothetical, by the way. I have no evidence of such an event. But the point is that if it had happened, we wouldn't be able to see it by looking at fossils, and such events have certainly happened, just like they happen now. Evolution in species that reach a morphological fitness maximum does not stop. And even further, neutral evolution will proceed regardless of how well fit to an environment a species is. So no, morphological stasis in the fossil record does not in any way indicate evolution not occurring.
Then the problem becomes even more acute. If 90% of the supposed 10 million years is spent in stasis,
which it's not, because we have many hominin species, and clearly they are not all the same.
then that reduces the number to 167 substitutions.
No, it doesn't, because even if hominins evinced morphological stasis, which they absolutely do not, that wouldn't mean that they were not evolving during that time. Those things are not correlated. How have I been doing this for so long and I can still be surprised by how insufferably wrong creationists can be? And given Don's education, it's really hard for me to maintain that he could possibly be speaking or writing in good faith when he says things like this. If I came to you touting my degree in English literature and then told you that the famous book Frankenstein was written by Chaucer, you'd have to assume that I'm lying, either about who wrote Frankenstein or about my credentials. That's where I am with Don Batten. So if you're a creationist, please let me know which you think I should assume, that Don Batten is lying about genetics or that he's lying about his credentials.
Haldane's dilemma was discussed a bit in the 1960s, but since then has been largely ignored in the evolutionary journals.
Yeah, you know why things are presented as problems tend to later on not be discussed much in journals? It's because we figured out the solution to the problem. There's a reason that no one is discussing the weird orbit of Mercury much in journals. It's because that problem was solved by Einstein and it's no longer weird. You know why no one really talks about Haldane's dilemma? Because evolutionary biologists and population geneticists figured out the solution. That's how science works. If you want to revive discussion about Haldane's dilemma or the orbit of Mercury being anomalous, you're going to have to show why the solutions that everyone knows work don't work. Good luck with that if that's your plan, but the simple fact that a problem that's been solved isn't really discussed much anymore isn't really surprising. And it's certainly not evidence that the problem is, in fact, a problem.
Genetics and biology texts did not, and do not, discuss the problem. In 1992, the high-profile evolutionary geneticist George C. Williams remarked that the time has come for renewed discussion and experimental attack on Haldane's dilemma. His plea apparently had no effect on his evolutionary colleagues.
Probably because he was wrong. In 2025, astrophysicist Avi Loeb said that scientists should be talking more about the alien origin of extrasolar comets. It had no real effect on the astronomy community because it's fucking wrong. That's what tends to happen when you're wrong and a scientist. People who know you're wrong don't want to waste their time on you or your wrong ideas, because they're trying to actually learn things, which wrong ideas are bad at helping with.
However, creationist Walter Remine published a work in 1993 which treated the issue in detail.
You know, normally when someone talks about publishing something in terms of science, what they mean is that they publish it in a journal after rigorous peer review. But do you think Walter did that? Pause the video and put in the comments if you think Walter's work was peer-reviewed. One group of people who would never cite non-peer-reviewed sources inappropriately in a discussion are my channel members. If you want to help the channel out and get access to videos like this months early, recognition in chat, once-a-month milestone chats, and access to my Discord for supporters, why not considering using the join button below this video? It starts at just $1.99 a month, and if you go to higher tiers, you can get more perks.
He has since worked on the matter, refining the argument and dealing with attempts at obfuscation by evolutionists, mainly anonymous persons on the internet.
The fact that Walter can't actually get any attention except from people like me, people who are not in the field, is not a sign of the quality of his work. I'm the kind of guy who responds to people like Roger from Mud Fossil University, which isn't a real university, or Raw Matt, the breatharian and ordained Essene, even though that isn't and has never been a thing. It's weird that Don Batten keeps giving me context for the work of Walter Remine that makes me think his work is really worthless.
Since the publication of Remine's book, there has been no serious dispute that Haldane's analysis, if correct, places a 1667 limit, a severe limit, on human evolution.
Sure, that's probably true. Just like if Star Trek is right, there's a severe limit on how much warp travel you can do in any part of the galaxy before the subspace in that region begins to degrade. Thing is, though, that that's not actually true. Just like Haldane's dilemma isn't actually a real problem. It was a problem with how biology was modeled, not how biology works. The model was wrong, and we fixed it. Well, I didn't. People who actually know what they're doing more than I do did that.
Remine claims that Haldane's dilemma has never been solved.
It's a mighty fine claim Don's got there. Too bad all of evolutionary biology disagrees with him. You know, you can't just say the puzzle of what fire is has never been solved just because you think phlogiston is cool and that oxygen is lame. It's still not true, even if the solution isn't the one you like. That the solution to Haldane's dilemma wasn't that humans are a recent creation by a supernatural being doesn't mean that the actual solution of recombination, natural selection, and the lack of need for mutations to fix before others arise isn't the right solution. And let's remember, Haldane's dilemma was never something that was going to turn out to be an actual insoluble problem, because just basic observation of large mammals like humans shows that it can't actually be true, since there would be no such animals if it were.
But rather has been confused, garbled, and prematurely brushed aside. The cause of the confusion largely has to do with misunderstanding or misconstruing the core concept, the cost of substitution.
Oh, I bet we're about to get a creationist redefining a well-defined term because otherwise they can't get their so-called problem to actually be a problem. You see, liars like John Sanford and idiots like Sal Cordova do this all the time with fitness, because they know that if they define fitness in the way that science does, the way that lets it be measurable, then fitness in populations can increase with no problem. So they have to make up an ill-defined wishy-washy version of it that means more like the kind of thing you go to the gym to get than actual reproductive success. That way, anytime anything gets worse at doing a thing, they can crow that fitness has actually decreased, even when it demonstrably has increased.
Some of the confusion could have arisen because Haldane was never very clear in his definition of what the cost was in physical terms, although he defined it mathematically.
No, he was extremely clear. It's genomes that do not go on to contribute to the next generation. Genomes are real physical things. Anytime a new genome forms, if it does not then go on to contribute to future genomes, it has, quote, died, in the sense that Haldane means. So if, as often happens in humans, an ovum is fertilized but fails to implant on the uterine wall, it is part of the cost of selection being paid. If it manages to implant but self-terminates as a result of some lethal mutation, it is part of the cost. If it is carried to full term but is infertile, it is part of the cost being paid. If a person fails to have children at all, that individual is part of the cost being paid. The cost is paid in genomes that do not reproduce for whatever reason. Ultimately, that means death without reproduction, but that death can be anywhere from fertilization all the way to a long, long life.
Many evolutionists have interpreted Haldane's cost of substitution in terms of death of individuals that do not have the mutation, genetic death, and superficially, this might seem reasonable.
Yes, because that's how Haldane defined it. If you think that it's not that, then you're talking about something other than Haldane's dilemma.
However, suppose competition with the mutant form causes lower birth rates for the non-mutant individuals. Then the genetic death cost becomes the number of individuals who would have been born to those who do not have the mutation, but were not born because of competition with the mutant form.
No, that's not what the cost of selection is. So we're not talking about Haldane's dilemma. Maybe this is Walter Remind's dilemma, but since apparently no one takes him seriously at all, I can see why someone would like to pretend that it's Haldane's dilemma, which is at least a thing in science historically.
In other words, it becomes a matter of virtual or imaginary deaths. It becomes an exercise in futility to try and model such a thing mathematically.
Yes, if you make up new definitions for mathematical terms that remove your ability to measure or estimate their value, that makes calculation impossible. Good thing Haldane didn't do that. How can Don think that making the problem incalculable is a good thing? If it's incalculable, then he can't really say it's a problem, since he can't even show that the problem exists mathematically.
On this basis, some evolutionists have dismissed Haldane's dilemma as imaginary, an unreal problem.
I'm pretty sure that no scientists have dismissed Haldane's dilemma as an unreal problem on the basis that creationists get it wrong. However, it was never a real problem for nature, it was only ever a problem for human modeling of nature. A problem which, again, is solved just by doing more detailed modeling and knowing that chromosomes can cross over.
In a paper in this issue, pages 113 to 125...
Yeah, this is copied from an article that appeared in print, and I'm already deep enough down the rabbit hole. I'm not going to check an article within an article. If I keep doing that, this will just become creationist inception, and I'll never actually get out of this.
Remine revisits this largely ignored problem for evolutionary theory. He significantly clarifies the nature of Haldane's dilemma as it has come to be known, by removing confusion over the meaning of the cost of substitution.
By just redefining it. Neat.
Remine defines and clarifies the cost of substitution such that no imaginary or virtual realities are involved. He puts it on a solid, physical and theoretical footing. Remine originally submitted this paper to mainstream, evolutionary, science journals.
Given how creationists normally feel about homosexuality, it's kind of surprising to see Don Batten glazing Walter Remine's knob this much. Also, why wasn't I just directed to something by Walter? This would be a lot easier if the 15 questions pamphlets just cited him instead of citing Don Batten fangirling all over Walter.
The paper has been under review for nearly 2.5 years, and it would appear that reviewers used every conceivable rationale to reject it.
First, some of the conceivable reasons for rejecting work from being published is that it's bad work. So thanks for telling on Walter, Don. Second, this has big Richard Carrier energy. Like when he was whining that by failing to pass peer review, he actually did pass peer review, which is something he did to cope with the fact that his most recent book, at the time of writing, isn't taken seriously by anyone who knows anything about the topic.
The shocking scandal. OP did undergo a full peer review at a real biblical studies press, but scandalously. The reviewers did not take it seriously, but only childishly slandered the book. When asked to identify any specific error of fact in it, they could deduce none. Instead, it was rejected solely on the grounds that it does not make a unique, original contribution to the field of biblical studies, which will help advance the discipline, and will not be interesting for readers within the discipline, and does not engage with the field/discipline. When you read it, you will be shocked at how resoundingly false all three of those accusations are, as Obsolete Paradigm does nothing but all three of those things. It is a serious work, thoroughly referenced and tightly argued. It is full of new findings and results. It thoroughly engages with all relevant arguments and publications of the field for the last 10 years. And it is essential reading to anyone within the discipline. In fact, their desire to avoid it with slander and fake charges precisely demonstrates its importance. The whole argument of the book is that the field is trying to hide from these findings and make them go away. The reviewers themselves ironically demonstrated the book's entire thesis is correct. The whole argument of the book is that the field is trying to hide from these findings and make them go away. The reviewers themselves ironically demonstrated that the book's entire thesis is correct. This means that OP actually passed peer review, because with respect to any real peer review, as in a full fact check for error or misstatement, obsolete paradigm passed. No specific error or misstatement in it was found, and the reviewers took 6 months to make sure. Instead, they had only blatantly Christian propagandist dismissals of the contents of the book to offer, and gave entirely bogus reasons not to publish it. And you can confirm this for yourselves by reading the book and seeing how absurd their claims are, and thus how desperate biblical historians are to avoid all of this. So now that it has survived a complete fact checked by 2 hostile peer reviewers who could challenge no facts nor find any fallacies in it, I've published it with Pitchstone.
For example, with one journal, 2 reviewers noted that Remine's cost concept was different from the traditional view and claimed it was wrong.
Because it is. That's a good reason to reject a paper about something. If you get the thing that you're talking about wrong, you shouldn't be published on that thing. If I wanted to get published in a linguistics journal, and to do so, I decided that I was going to redefine grammar to mean the instrument which makes glyphs when writing, then I would be rightly rejected from publication. This is pretty basic.
After he showed they had misread the paper.
After he claimed they had misread the paper.
And that the paper is correct and makes correct predictions, the reviewers shifted to a different reason to reject it.
It can't make correct predictions because Haldane's dilemma never has. It's not possible that it's right. That's why it was a dilemma. Organisms don't actually produce as much as they would need to according to the dilemma. Despite this, they do in fact observably increase in fitness, and new alleles fix far faster than the dilemma would predict. These aren't questions we have to ask, they're observations. They're observations just like we use telescopes to observe stars. I don't care what theoretical objection to the existence of stars you can come up with, because when I look for stars, I can see them. I don't care what theoretical limits to the rate of fixation of new alleles you can come up with if it's lower than the actual observed fixation rates in real organisms.
With another journal, 4 reviewers, most papers are only reviewed by 2 other scientists, acknowledged Remine's paper was correct, but 2 of them, high-profile evolutionary geneticists, rejected the paper on the grounds that they, and some of their associates, knew of the subject matter in the 1970s. In other words, they claimed the analysis was not original.
I'm skeptical of this claim. Who reviews a paper is usually anonymous, and so to claim that Walter knows that 2 of them were high profile means that he must know who the reviewers were. But that's unlikely. I think the story is made up. But even if it's not exactly surprising that creationists can't come up with anything new, since they rarely are much better than 50 years behind where science is, and are often more like 80 years or more behind.
However, they were unable to cite a single book or paper that contained this material. In other words, the journal had no legitimate grounds for rejecting Remine's paper.
Again, I really don't think this story is true, but failing to produce any previous work that has the exact analysis and results of Remine's isn't necessary to say that his work is unoriginal. And it's not like there's some obvious bias to suppress Haldane's dilemma. That's why, when it was still an open problem, it was in fact discussed. But no one wants to go around wasting time on a problem that was solved decades ago just because some random asshole thinks that maybe if it actually is a problem, then it proves that God exists. I'd also like to point out that many of the people who would be qualified to peer review Remine's book do in fact believe in God, even the Trinitarian God of traditional Christianity.
And, just as importantly, this response implicitly acknowledges that the evolutionary workers in the field knowingly allowed confusions and errors to thrive, overwhelmingly, even to the present day.
Does it? I don't see how it does that.
Haldane was aware his conclusions would probably need drastic revision. Remine's paper contributes to that revision. Not only does he clarify the concept of cost of substitution and show how Haldane's formulas can be rederived with the more robust concept, but he also generalizes the cost concept. He does this by eliminating the need for constant population size, small selection coefficients, etc.
Good for him. Too bad no one who actually knows what they're talking about find any value in it. It's almost like maybe, like many wackos who can't get published because they're obviously wrong, Walt is just full of himself and can't stand that people don't see his non-existent brilliance. It's almost like maybe he is acting narcissistically, something that is usually seen as negative, except apparently when someone is running to be the next elected king of the former United States.
Higher selection coefficients actually make the problem worse for evolutionists.
Okay.
Romine also deals with various attempts by confused evolutionists to circumvent Haldane's dilemma, e.g., that environmental change can alleviate the problem. The take-home message, which was not spelled out in his paper because it was written to be submitted to mainstream evolutionary journals, is the evolutionary origin of organisms with low reproduction rates and long generation times, many higher animals, is impossible, even given the usual millions of years assigned to the history of species on Earth.
Yeah, that was the conclusion that Walt selected before he began working, so it's not surprising he got there. But that's because he's not a scientist, he's a pseudoscientist. Scientists look for answers in the data, and pseudoscientists have the answers and look for data to support their conclusion. Walt, Don, and the two chucklefucks that are coming up next, now that we're done with this article, are all pseudoscientists at best.
And now the famous evolutionist geneticist J.B.S. Haldane, he was one of the three founders in the field of population genetics.
That's true.
Now he, as an evolutionist,
he's an evolutionist. First note.
Yes, he's passed away now, but he was an evolutionist, and he noted there was a serious problem which has become known as Haldane's dilemma. Now,
yes, he noticed a problem with his model. Obviously, it's not a problem with reality, because whenever a model disagrees with reality, it's the model's problem, not reality. That, of course, is something that creationists and flat earthers, or wrong earthers as I call them collectively, simply cannot figure out. They're all acting like flat earthers, insisting that there is no 24-hour sun in the Antarctic summer because their model says there can't be, even after a number of prominent flat earthers went to Antarctica and saw the 24-hour sun firsthand, and after it was both live-streamed and recorded in both real-time and time-lapse. Creationists are in the same boat. They have a model that they really like, and despite the fact that it doesn't match reality at basically any point, they insist that the model is telling them the truth and that you should ignore the evidence of your lying eyes. And hey, on the off chance that Will Duffy is watching, this is why you get people like myself saying that flat earth and creationism are basically the same thing. It's because over and over and over, creationists act just like flat earthers.
see, if a beneficial mutation were to occur,
which they observably do, go on,
in a population, and it's going to become fixed in that population, then it has to increase in numbers, obviously.
I mean, yeah, but the way we normally talk about that is that it has to increase the proportion of organisms in the population who have it. That's because we're talking about fixation. That is the process that results in all members of the population having the variation. So the raw number doesn't matter much and is dependent on the population size. So if a new allele is present in 10,000 members of a population, that doesn't tell if it's fixed. If the population is 10,000, then it is. But if the population is in the billions, like it is for humans, then it's not even close to being fixed.
In the population for it to progress evolutionary in an evolutionary fashion, right?
Did Calvin Smith just have a mini stroke or something? That wasn't even English near as I can tell. This is like reading a tweet or truth or whatever the hell they're calling it from the King of America.
Relative to all of the other specimens in that population that don't have that beneficial mutation.
That's not how the word specimen is used. A specimen is an example of something that is currently being used for testing or investigation or observation, or has been collected for such. The word he's looking for is member, as in member of that population. Once again, it's not a huge deal, but it indicates that these two don't actually know what they're talking about when they misuse terms used in science.
That's right, because if one of the organisms gets the beneficial mutation, well, and that's a benefit, well, that's great for that organism, but that organism is going to die sooner or later. So unless that gene gets passed along and widely spread, it's not going to get fixed.
Evolution theory would suggest that beneficial mutation needs to wipe out, those individuals need to wipe out, or all the others need to somehow disappear.
That's right, over time.
And then evolution can...
No, they just reproduce less than those with the mutation. They can have perfectly normal long lives and not just disappear. In fact, they don't even have to have fewer children than they would have without the new mutation appearing. Creationists are just physically incapable of correctly or even reasonably describing evolution.
Yeah,
Progress.
but the problem with that, of course, is the rate at which that could happen is limited.
It is, just not enough to preclude evolution in the sense of universal common ancestry. And let's remember that the limited rate that these two are supporting here would also preclude post-flood speciation of arc kinds, which means that if this problem is real, it's as much a problem for creationists as it is for anyone else.
As a matter of fact, the biggest limiting factors, of course, is how quickly you can procreate, right? I mean, because there's two ways of doing it here. If you know, they actually talked about, you know, an imaginary scenario where, let's say you've got, you know, ape-like creatures, hominids or whatever. We're not fully human yet, and you know, let's say you've got like humans, you've got a birth rate of whatever, and it takes you, let's say, 20 years to, you know, to keep making new generations and stuff like that. So if you imagine a population of 100,000 apes, these supposed, you know, progenitors of the human race,
This guy sure likes to yap.
and you get a male and a female that somehow get this mutation that's beneficial.
You don't need to get a male and female both with the mutation, just one will do fine.
Well, number one, in order for that to get passed on, then obviously they'd have to find each other in that group of 100,000.
No, they wouldn't. Does Calvin not know how sex works? Children inherit their genes from both parents, so your mom or your dad have a mutation, then there's a 25% chance you have it too, regardless of the fact that they don't both have it. And that's assuming it happens on one of their chromosomes and not the other, since, you know, that's how mutation works. You don't need to have two homozygous parents to get a mutation passed on. This is fucking high school Punnett Square shit. How the hell can he be this fucking dumb? This is something I'd expect from raw, eating is optional Matt Nyler, the alleged inventor of the kale chip.
People anyway, and pass it on. But you've got a couple of things you could do. If their offspring is going to become the mainstream with that mutation, 99,998 other ones, they've got to either disappear somewhere, or that particular mutant group has somehow got to get their you know, next generation to somehow outcompete them and outpopulate them.
Yeah, that's it. They outpopulate them. And when that happens and other parts of the population that lack the mutation mate, they'll become more likely to mate with those parts of the population that do have the mutation. And thereby some of their offspring will have it too. And since those offspring are more likely to themselves reproduce and reproduce more than their other offspring, the portion of the population with the new variation increases. Maybe Calvin Smith needs to go back and relearn like 9th grade biology.
An order of magnitude improvement over the remaining population.
No, it doesn't need to be an order of magnitude. It can be less than a single part in 100 improvement in spread. It just depends on population size, and the larger the population, the more likely it is for even small improvements in reproductive output to be selected for.
That they just procreate and all the others die out.
Nope, that's never been how it works, at least not in species that can exchange genetic material, which includes most bacteria, by the way.
Exactly. So I'm going to read this just so it'll make more sense to people.
Well, it couldn't make less sense.
Okay, so you've got an imaginary population. You've got 100,000 apes, and you get this male and female. They both receive a mutation so beneficial that they out-survived everybody else.
No, in addition to the dumb f***ery of thinking you need a male and female to both have the mutation spontaneously, and that they then have to mate with each other, which is something so dumb the average 15-year-old can tell you why it's wrong, they also don't have to out-survive anything. They just have to out-reproduce the rest of the population.
All the rest of the population died out, and then the surviving pair had enough offspring to replenish the population in one generation.
None of this bears any resemblance to anything in the real world.
Now, this is a supposed scenario, of course, but this is what would have to happen.
No, it's not.
If you repeated this imaginary situation every generation, every 20 years, for 10 million years, more, which of course is the supposed time since the last common ancestor, supposedly of apes and humans, that would mean that you'd have 500,000 beneficial mutations that could be added to the population. But even with this completely unrealistic scenario, which maximizes evolutionary progress,
no, it actually severely retards it because it prevents other beneficial mutations from arising and continuing to increase their frequency in the population at the same time as the one under consideration, which on its own is like half the solution to Haldane's dilemma. They need to stop treating it like you have to have a mutation fixed before the next one can occur that will fix. You can have more than one mutation moving towards fixation at a time in real life, but not in this scenario.
Only about 0.02% of the human genome would be generated.
Well, since the common ancestor of humans and chimps didn't start with no genome, I don't see why this is even a thing Calvin would say, except that he's just accepting the obviously bullshit talking point of Don Batten, the known liar.
Oops. It's a totally unrealistic scenario, right?
Right, which is why it's kind of dumb to talk about.
And you keep having to, because the mutation that occurs, I mean, if you're going to have it accumulate, it keeps needing to occur in the same group. But if you've got a mutation here and a mutation here and a mutation here, somehow you've got to bring all those mutations together to keep stacking up this.
Yep, and that's where recombination comes in. This so-called problem is already solved. And Calvin Smith being unable to pass a high school biology class isn't a problem for science. It's evidence that he's either a colossal moron or he's a colossal liar. You tell me which.
So the dilemma is, even given the most favorable conditions for evolution,
right,
the results are nowhere near what they need to be.
Sure, if by the most favorable conditions you mean absurd conditions that severely retard the generation of new mutations and more or less prevents significant recombination, but most people would consider that to be among the least favorable conditions.
That's right, because that's only 0.02 of the human genome,
right.
And considering that the difference between the DNA of a human and a chimp, our supposed closest living relative, which that's another story we'll get into sometime, but anyway, even that is supposedly greater than 5%.
It depends on how you count it, and most of the differences are not the result of selection, they're the result of drift. Plus, about half of those differences would have occurred on the chimp side. Chimps aren't the common ancestor of chimps and humans. As a back-of-the-envelope way to estimate how much one lineage has changed genetically from its common ancestor with another lineage, just have the amount of genetic difference between them, since all things being equal, they are both evolving and diverging from that ancestor. But also, in coding regions, the similarity is closer to 1%, meaning that the change from common ancestor in terms of the changes that are most likely to be beneficial is more like 0.5%. Of course, these are all very rough estimates, but then Calvin's estimates are based on just making shit up, so I'm okay with that.
Well, obviously 0.02 to 5%, that's a huge problem. So,
if it is, it's not for any of the reasons we've been given so far.
Haldane's dilemma basically has not been solved. That's what Don's article was about.
And that is incorrect, although I'd argue that to a large degree it was more about Don Batten's lust for Walter Remine. And hey, I say Don should just ask Walter to grab some coffee and see what happens. Maybe they can go retire together someplace nice, have lots of gay sex, and leave the pseudoscience to others.
There have been some evolutionists that have tried to, there wasn't much done. It was talked about a little bit in the 60s.
By there wasn't much done, what he means is that the dilemma was solved and the field moved on. But he just doesn't like that.
But then it was kind of largely ignored by most evolutionists until 1992, when an evolutionist, George C. Williams, remarked this: "The time has come for renewed discussion and experimental attack on Haldane's dilemma."
And then, since that wasn't really true and the solution to it was well known, that was mostly ignored. Just like if an astronomer today were to say that maybe we need to re-examine the precession of the orbit of Mercury since it doesn't seem to obey Newton's laws.
So basically, this is a problem that, let's not talk about it too much. All of a sudden, this evolutionist makes the statement here: we need to attack Haldane's dilemma. Why?
So they want to try and get through the dilemma, this dilemma for evolution.
That's right.
The why was probably that he incorrectly thought that the changes to the model that had been made that solved the dilemma were insufficient.
Yeah.
And so he wanted experimental attack. He wanted some observational proof that this wasn't true.
We already have that. We have both observational and experimental evidence that Haldane's dilemma isn't a thing in the real world. It was only ever a thing in human-made models.
And so, of course, we carry a book called The Biotic Message by Walter James Remine. And he did an extensive, restudy, you could say, on Haldane's dilemma.
Yeah, so I've heard.
And really pointed out what the problem was, because most of the criticisms that came against Haldane's dilemma, they were kind of criticizing, okay, well, you don't really need to get rid of all those other things. You just need to concentrate on, the creatures that get the mutation and stuff like that.
I have no idea what Calvin is talking about, probably because he has no idea what he's talking about. Probably because he doesn't know what Haldane's dilemma is, nor does he have even a basic understanding of genetics that would be expected of a school child.
But what Remine pointed out, and he had a great article, we have it online, you can check out too, it's called, just go to creation.com/cost.
Geez, more homework, and this won't be short either. That article is long. Oh well, let's save it for next time. Or more likely the next 2 times, because this short little series is threatening to turn into a 6-episode monster. If you like my long compilation videos, I bet my compilation of this series will be more than 5 hours long. Oh well. If you like this video, hit like and let me know what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, I hope you subscribe and check out the channel memberships and my Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Tapioca Weasel, Sphincter of Doom, Regios, Landon Knoll, Ian Chen, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivera, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, David Hercules, Joshua Geese, Vollus, Dan Sheedy, Pega Jace, The Plastic Mouse, Arrow Dodger, Gordon Love Science, Amber Athelian, Pixie Purple, Agricola Siqua, and John Ackerman. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 15% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.